The last part of this unit is on the respiratory system. The function of the respiratory system is to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide between the air, the blood, and body tissues. The respiratory system works very closely with our circulatory system, as our circulatory system serves as the transportation system for the respiratory system. The pathway of airflow into the body would be through the nose or mouth, to the pharynx or throat, the larynx or voice box, the trachea or windpipe, the bronchi, the lungs, the bronchioles, and finally the alveoli. Breathing out, that pathway would be reversed. This gives you an overview of the different structures of the respiratory system and their main functions. So going into more detail of the structures of the respiratory system, first we have the nose and the nasal cavity. The nose and the nasal cavity are lined with cilia and mucus, which helps to warm, moisten, and filter the air that we're breathing. The air then passes to the pharynx. The pharynx is also considered the back of our throat, and the pharynx is a passageway for food and air. There are three parts to the pharynx. The nasopharynx is directly behind the nasal cavity, and that is an air-only passageway. The oropharynx is directly behind the mouth or oral cavity, and that is an air and food passageway. And the last part of the pharynx is the laryngopharynx, and that as well is an air and food passageway. From the pharynx, we then move to the larynx. The larynx is an air passageway that's also called the voice box. The larynx contains our vocal cords. Our vocal cords are bands of smooth muscle which vibrate and produce sound as air moves over them. The vocal cords of the larynx are protected by the laryngeal prominence. This is a large piece of cartilage in front of the vocal cords. It moves up and down during speaking or swallowing. And this is what's also called the Adam's apple. Now, both men and women have a laryngeal prominence or an Adam's apple. However, it's usually not noticeable in females. And that's because this piece of cartilage grows larger and becomes more pronounced in males due to their higher levels of testosterone. The epiglottis is a flap of cartilage that's at the top of the larynx. It closes off the larynx when we're swallowing so that food slides behind the larynx and the trachea into the esophagus. If the epiglottis fails to close properly, you could have food or drink accidentally go into the larynx and the trachea. And if you've ever had something go down the wrong tube, that's exactly what's happening. The food is going down the wrong tube. It's going into the trachea rather than the esophagus that it's supposed to. So coming off of the larynx, we have the trachea, which is our airway tube. It's composed of incomplete cartilage rings. So these rings are C-shaped or U-shaped. These rings ensures that the airway stays open at all times. So it makes sure that our airway is constantly open and it doesn't collapse. But because the cartilage rings are incomplete in the back, it allows the esophagus to expand into the tracheal space when you're swallowing. From the trachea, there are two branches which are called bronchi. So these are two large passageways that split from the trachea and each lead to a separate lung. The lungs themselves are the location of respiratory physiology, or the actual function of the respiratory system. Everything up until the lungs have just been passageways to get the air where it needs to go. The left lung is actually a bit smaller than our right lung. The right lung is divided into three sections or lobes, whereas the left lung only has two lobes. The left lung is smaller because it allows room for the heart, which remember is slightly to the left side of the body. Each lung is enclosed in a sac called the pleural membrane. This is a double-layered protective tissue that surrounds each lung. A collapsed lung is when air or fluid enters the pleural space between the pleural membranes. If air or fluid enters this space, it prevents the lung from expanding, and so that's what we call a collapsed lung. Within the lung, the bronchi keep dividing into smaller and smaller passageways, and the smallest microscopic passageways are called bronchioles. The bronchioles are tiny air passages that branch from the bronchi. And at the end of the bronchioles are tiny air sacs that are called alveoli. Alveoli are microscopic air sacs at the end of the bronchioles, which are grouped in clusters. They kind of look like grapes. The alveoli are surrounded by capillaries, and this allows for the diffusion of gases between the alveoli of the lungs and the blood. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood into the alveoli, which we then can breathe out, and oxygen diffuses out of the alveoli into the blood. In total, we have about 700 million total alveoli. This increases the surface area for more gas exchange. So our lungs are not two hollow structures within our chest that just completely fill with air and then deflate when we breathe out. Instead, our lungs are solid structures composed of millions and millions of these alveoli, the tiny air sacs. By having the tiny air sacs, we're able to have much more surface area for much more gas exchange. Here's an example. On the left, if each lung was one large air sac, there would be limited surface area for capillaries to do the gas exchange. So we would only have that yellow outlined area to do gas exchange. By each lung consisting of millions of microscopic air sacs, there is so much more surface area for gas exchange to take place. So on the right side, you can see by having many more small air sacs, there is the potential for much more surface area, so much more gas exchange can occur. The diaphragm, which is at the base of our thoracic cavity, is our primary breathing muscle. So the diaphragm is going to help us function in breathing. Breathing is a two-step process. We have inhalation and exhalation. Inhalation is breathing in. When this happens, our thoracic cavity volume increases. Our rib muscles contract and lift up the rib cage. The diaphragm also contracts and flattens out. So we now have a larger chest volume. This decreases the pressure in the chest and air rushes into the lungs, filling that extra space. Exhalation is the opposite process. This is breathing out. So think exit for exhalation. When this occurs, the thoracic cavity volume decreases. The rib muscles relax and the rib cage falls. The diaphragm relaxes and goes more upward into a dome shape. This causes there to be excess pressure in the chest, and air is pushed out of the lungs because of this. You can actually feel at least what's occurring with the rib cage as you take a deep inhalation and then an exhalation. You can actually feel the rib cage be pulled upward and outward when you breathe in, and then you can feel your rib cage fall when you breathe out. Breathing is an involuntary activity. For a normal adult, the resting breathing rate is about 12 to 20 breaths per minute. Children have a faster resting breathing rate than adults do. It is involuntary. Now, we do have the ability to some degree, control our breathing. You can make yourself breathe faster. You can make yourself breathe slower. You can hold your breath, but it's not something that you can control long term. For example, you hold your breath, and eventually your brain will step in and force you to start breathing again. This I thought was just a fun, mysterious breathing illusion. When you read what's in the center, it says the blue gas is now moving back and forth. Take slow breaths in and out. After some time, the gas will follow your breathing. It moves one way when you slowly breathe in, and it moves the other way when you slowly breathe out. So breathing, which is involuntary, is controlled by the medulla oblongata of the brainstem. When your body is determining how you should be breathing, the medulla is actually monitoring the amount of carbon dioxide in your blood, not oxygen. And the reason for this is that carbon dioxide is a toxin to our cells. And so your body is monitoring the carbon dioxide level to make sure that that doesn't get too high. If carbon dioxide levels become too high, your breathing rate begins to increase. That way, you're able to expel more carbon dioxide, and at the same time, you take in more oxygen. Breathing is regulated by the autonomic nervous system. Our parasympathetic nervous system keeps breathing normal and slow, whereas our sympathetic nervous system, how we react under stress, increases our breathing rate. So remember that the circulatory and respiratory systems are closely intertwined. And so the process of gas exchange involves both coordination of the circulatory and respiratory systems. So oxygen is taken into the lungs through inhalation. The oxygen then diffuses from the alveoli into the blood. The oxygen then binds to hemoglobin within red blood cells, and that oxygenated blood travels through pulmonary veins to the left atrium of the heart. The oxygenated blood then passes through the mitral valve. Then the oxygenated blood enters the left ventricle. Blood is pumped through the aortic valve into the aorta. Blood then passes through arteries and arterioles into capillaries. Oxygen is released by hemoglobin. Oxygen then diffuses into the body cells that need it. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of cells as a waste into the blood. That deoxygenated blood passes through venules and veins, eventually back to the heart. The deoxygenated blood travels through the vena cava to the right atrium of the heart. That deoxygenated blood passes through the tricuspid valve. The deoxygenated blood then enters the right ventricle, which pumps the blood through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary arteries. That carbon dioxide blood enters the lung capillaries. The carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood into the alveoli, and the carbon dioxide is then expelled in exhalation.